over time, over the last 30 years, right, you received what would have been considered 30 years ago to be a quote unquote death sentence. And
It
yet,
was.
what I've heard from you is how that death sentence actually taught you to live in a new and different
Absolutely.
way.
It did. Yeah, when you think you're going to die, you start to think, oh, well, what am I doing now? And do I even care about this? And it's kind of like you start to notice even the free stuff. You start to notice the clouds and you start to notice well, you do smell the roses and children are just so like it was hard to be sad with three little kids. They're just pretty quite entertaining.
Hey there, Flourish or Fold listeners. We are so excited to bring you this next episode with our guest, Julie Lewis. Now, Julie Lewis is the mother of Ryan Lewis, who is an incredibly well-known music producer, having worked with Macklemore and many others. However, this is not the story of being the mother of a well-known hip-hop artist. It's the story of a young woman who answered the phone in her kitchen in the 1990s and found that through a blood transfusion, she had contracted HIV/AIDS and how her life changed forever. This is just not a story of a healthcare diagnosis. It's a human story about how we show up for unexpected moments in our lives and allow ourselves to have the grace and humanity to work through some of the most difficult moments when we're faced with some incredibly unexpected challenges. Listen in now to my conversation with Julie Lewis as we talk about her new book, Still Positive, and surviving with HIV/AIDS for more than 3 decades. Welcome back to our next episode of Flourish or Fold, where well-known people share their lesser well-known stories of facing challenge, change, and complexity. Today, I have with me Julie Lewis. Now, Julie is the author of the relatively recently published book this year in 2023 entitled Still Positive, and she is a staunch and lifelong advocate for women's health and wellness. And Julie, I'm just delighted to have you here today to have a conversation about health, wellness, and well-being, and to have you bring us on the journey of your experiences personally and how that's impacted what your mission and vision is for the world.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me on the show. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about not only the book, but just my long journey and just some of the things that have happened and what I've learned along the way. So let's do it.
Let's do it.
Yeah,
Well,
let's do it.
we'll just jump right in because what I find with many of the people that I interview is there's sometimes a series of experiences that happen for us in life, right? And they're sort of additive or iterative and they add up over time. And then for many people, there's a moment or a singular moment or a couple really crystallizing moments where life just takes a 180-degree pivot and really shifts, and things are not the same in that way again. And I think this was a moment for you where you had that experience. So I'd love to just walk into, Julie, this moment when you faced a significant challenge and what emerged for you. What was that experience like?
Well, I've had both the instant change of your life, and then I've had many aha moments that I'll share along the way. But this is the book, Still Positive, and the first chapter is called The Phone Call. And the phone call
Mm.
was the moment that my life just took a giant pivot in a direction that I never, ever imagined it would go. So we were living in Western Washington, and we were literally packing our U-Haul to move 5 hours east to a town right on the Idaho border. And I got a phone call. And it was my doctor who had delivered my first child, who was at the time 6. My kids were 2, 4, and 6 in this moment. And he started the conversation with, "You better sit down," which is always like a bad news. And so I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, this is maybe nothing to worry about because it was 6.5 years ago. But one of the people who gave you blood for your blood transfusion," I'd had a postpartum hemorrhage, so I got a blood transfusion, "has AIDS. And I'm recommending that you go get an HIV test." And it was 1990, and I knew quite a bit about HIV because I'm a health teacher. But it's like I knew in that instant that I was HIV positive, because for at least a year and a half, I'd been really sick. I'd had all these symptoms. I'd go to doctors, nobody could figure it out. And it just like the light bulb moment was like, oh, this is what's wrong with me. And it was what was wrong with me. But the really sad thing was, and the really scary thing was, is that I actually had to have every person in my family tested that week, because my youngest daughter, even though she was born before the blood transfusion, I had breastfed her, and you can get infected that way. I had 2 children after that, and so they were born to an HIV positive mom, and you can get it that way. And then, of course, Scott and I, you're not using condoms if you're pregnant. We were pregnant most of that time. So that was 6.5 years. And I just expected that my husband, Scott, would be infected. And, the real miracle was that none of them were infected. It was just me. So that was the beginning of a very long journey. Because my kids were 2, 4, and 6 years old, and we were moving to a very conservative town, we decided not to tell anyone for 4 years. We just told a very few people because, I just didn't want my 2-year-old dealing with HIV discrimination and stigma, which was very real at that time. And then, long story short, so the whole first section, my book's in 3 sections. My whole first section of the book is that 4 years of isolation. And it's a lot about the people who got me through that. I was very, very sick. I was given 3 to 5 years to live, if I was lucky. It was kind of like this. I asked the doctor, "How long do you think I will live?" And he said, "Well, if you're lucky," he said it out loud, "you might live 3 to 5 years, but the last 2 years are going to be really bad. So you better go do whatever you want to do right now." Now I was 32 years old. So I was like, oh my gosh. So anyway, that whole first section is pretty emotional. And and I think one of my aha moments during that time was, it's a really terrible life to sit around and wait to die. And so I was really struggling with like, what do you even do with that? And then one day, it was probably 6 months in, this was an aha moment. I woke up and I just thought, I don't feel any more dead than I did yesterday. And I started to think about my little kids, and I thought, I don't want them to remember me as a person waiting around to die. So I kind of jumped deeply into denial at that point. I knew I was not healthy and that death was looming, but I just decided not to think about it. And I decided that I would talk to my kids like I was going to live a really long time. I'd say stuff, "Well, when I'm your kid's grandma, blah, 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 blah." And they would laugh. And then I was just thinking, talking about it is better than nothing at all. Even if it was never meant to be, we can imagine it, right? So I think that was a real change in just my attitude and my just my outlook for every day. It's like, well, I woke up, I'm still here. I might as well go do stuff, with a good attitude. So that was, in the first section of our book, probably a real pivotal moment as far as just my day-to-day life. And then this middle part of the book, once we went public, I'm a health teacher and an educator, and I had learned very clearly about the stigma, and not just, I was sort of in the closet, but you have to go to the doctor, just the stigma at the doctor's office. And they knew I was HIV positive, was just like, not from my immediate doctor, but from every caregiver that I ran into. They would make judgments about you and why you were there,
Yeah. And Julie, I wonder if I could just stop you right there
Yes.
because, for me, I was born in the 1970s, right? So I remember watching the news. There was a young boy who really was very much nationally known, Ryan White,
Yeah.
who had also gotten HIV through a blood transfusion. He was shunned by his peers. His mother had to put him in different schools, like Michael Jackson came and visited him,
I
I mean,
know. Yeah.
this idea, I think for people maybe who were born later or more recently, we haven't talked about, HIV or AIDS for a really long time in the public discourse. And so I wonder if you could just sort of rewind for us, like into the 1990s. What are we talking about relative to like stigma and that type of those generalizations, those stereotypes that you're navigating in this moment?
Well, I'm going to tell you some of the things I navigated, but like I said, for 4 years, I just was silent, which a lot of people chose to be.
Sure.
But as far as families go, yeah, Ryan White, he literally couldn't go to school. He was on video for school for his life, and he had died in 1990. So yeah. Anyway, things that my friends that I saw them having to deal with, many people got rejected by their families. So I'm in a mid-size town in Eastern Washington, but a lot of the people who I met there with HIV were from small towns, and their families did not want anything to do with them. A lot of times, people, when they said they were HIV positive, they were also disclosing that they were perhaps a gay person, a gay man. And then, so many of them literally never had funerals because their families rejected them. They didn't want anything to do with it. People were very fearful. I had a couple friends who their families made them use paper plates and plastic utensils because they thought that you couldn't wash it off the dishes. I mean, I could just go on and on and on. People were afraid of this disease. There was a lot of misinformation that the government was lying to you. There were other ways to get it. Don't believe the things you hear. So people, didn't want their kids coming to your house or playing with your children or going to schools. One of my good friends with HIV in Spokane, where I was living, who had a child, my youngest son, Ryan's age, she was born HIV positive, her daughter. And when she started kindergarten, first grade, when she started first grade and went to the public schools, it was front page news. Like, her mom wanted people to know that they had nothing to worry about, and she wanted to educate the educators, but it was literally on the front page of our newspaper. And this is a town of 300,000 people. So it's like, people were trying to figure it out. The president at the time wasn't helpful. Ronald Reagan, he was very homophobic. He thought it was God's judgment. This was a disease where people judged people according to their lifestyle choices and blamed them, had no compassion. How am I doing? It's like, it was crazy. It was a crazy disease. And there was a taste of that with COVID. That was a very politicized disease, and people had opinions, and the politicians got involved. That hasn't happened since AIDS, on such a large level. Yeah. So there was a little bit of a flashback there.
Yeah, I love that thread that you've woven for us, both in terms of your experience and retelling some of the experiences of others. And then for people who didn't live in that era, the closest thing that we've sort of come to, recently was the highly politicized, lots of fear, again, mistrust or distrust of the government, of the vaccine. So for people who are living in this day and age, right, that is not the full complement of your experience and people who were diagnosed with HIV or AIDS. And yet when we think about, sort of what's that thread that we can pull through, what's the closest thing that people may have experienced, right? Like COVID has come the closest. So I love that you've sort of given us that example.
I mean, I was at the doctor's office several times where, it starts with the receptionist. If they know you're HIV positive, they assume you're seeking drugs. They assume you're on public assistance. They assume you're not married. Like I can go on and on. So there's this assumptions that you start out with. And then, I had strep throat and I went to the lab to get my throat swabbed, and the lady was too afraid to get close to me. She asked me to swab my own throat. And then she was fully like in like, like the gear that you would wear if you're in a toxic situation. And I'm just
like a
getting
hazmat suit or something.
Yes, I'm literally getting my throat swabbed. And I was like, oh my gosh, sure. She was so nervous. I kind of felt bad for her, but it was like, yeah, I'll swab my own throat. And then she didn't even want to touch it. Just leave it on the table. I mean, it was stuff like that. I had appendicitis and I needed immediate surgery. And it took them 12 hours to find a surgeon who would operate on me. My appendix ruptured in the meantime. So it was a lot of fear. Yeah.
And so, I'm curious for you, Julie, what you're saying is really powerful because here you've been diagnosed, right? And now the environment around you, the news, healthcare providers, people in your community, potentially, they're reflecting back to you this fear, this sense of discrimination, these judgments. And I think one thing that's really powerful is that, our environment and how people respond to us and look at us and treat us, it is so powerful in terms of how we develop our self-concept, how we construct our identity. So for you, you've got these people looking at you as though you've done something wrong. You're this sort of pariah of society. People are frightened of you. Did you take that on ever? And internally, how have you what's the conversation within yourself to not take that on, or to take as little of that on as possible into the person that you are?
Yeah, I pretty much face things full on. That's just who I am. I've always been that way from when I was a small child. And so that's a whole middle section of the book. Once we went public, I joined a speakers bureau with about 15 other HIV positive people. And I was on that speakers bureau for 10 years because I'm a health educator. I ended up working for the health department around bloodborne pathogens in general and doing all the trainings for professional people working in healthcare. But it's like, yeah, I was quite a debater in high school. Like I like arguing. I like having a point. I like convincing people of things. I like telling stories to change people's attitudes. And I've always been that way. So in a way, going public was a relief. For one, keeping a family secret is a lot of energy. That is harder to me than just slowly helping people see something differently, and I'm not mean about it. I don't judge people for it, but I have a high belief, a strong belief in education and storytelling to change attitudes about many things. So, I've been a public speaker now for over 30 years. And I mean, that's what I do. And I'm good at it. But it's like, it really is an art to like tell stories in a way that move people, because people don't change in their head, they change in their heart. And so you have to like, you can't, the hardest part about writing this book is this is AIDS light, because you don't want people to like, you can't get through the real story. It's not, very few people can actually take that on. So you have to tell stories, and they give people breathing room and let them laugh a little, and then tell them another story. Because, when it's a very hard situation that deals with death and dying, and so many people dying, and there's a lot of things in life that are comparable to this, there's very few people who just have the stamina for that emotionally. So to educate other people, you have to kind of break it way down to the smallest points of like, we're humans, people have souls, and this person was an amazing person, and look at what they went through, and how they still loved everyone or gave back, or, you have to kind of make a tapestry of these things for people to really ingest it. And that's what this book is. Yeah. And it's, I can just say this is about HIV, but it's really a mom story. It's a mom story and a family story, and a story about communities that made all the difference. Like, I could not have done this last 40 years on my own.
One of the things that I love that you shared is you talked about that you weren't just going to sit around and die, and that you actually really changed your demeanor and how you were, call it, with your children and your day-to-day life, showing up in the world, to the extent that you started talking about the positive vision that you had for the future. And even though you'd been given 3 to 5 years to live, if you were lucky, you actually started talking about your vision for the future, engaging with your children's children, your grandchildren. Do you think that made a difference in terms of your health, the trajectory of this diagnosis, that you changed your mindset and you changed how you talked about your future?
Well, I'm not sure. To be honest, I think it made a difference for me, but whether that's how I survived, I hate making statements like that, because I have so many great friends who had positive outlooks who actually died. Like, so many of my friends died. So many. I have an HIV positive brother who's still alive. He's a gay man. He's lost so many friends over the years. And yes, we're both of us are pretty positive, and I'm sure that didn't hurt. But I think we were really lucky, to be honest. It's there wasn't a thread of these are the people who died and these are the people who lived. It was random. Life can be random, and I felt like it was random. And we were really lucky. And yes, it hasn't hurt that we're positive people and that we, try to give back to the world and that. But I know other survivors, and we're all people. That's our common denominator. And we're all worthy to be alive, but so were all our friends who died. So yeah, I'm not sure that I think being positive has given to the quality of my life. I don't know that it's given to the longevity. I just feel like that was just that I had good fate and luck. Yeah.
I love your reframe of that. And I think that's really powerful, that being positive, it was random, if people lived or didn't, and that perhaps being positive didn't necessarily change the trajectory, but it did change the quality.
Exactly.
That's beautiful. I want to read, I was going over your bio and some of the materials that you submitted to prepare for today, and I wanted to read this paragraph. I thought it was really striking. It says, Julie's story is not a healthcare advocacy manual or history of HIV. It's a story told from the eyes of someone forced to stand up for themselves and their friends who were desperately in need of care. This book is an account of the AIDS trajectory in the early days of the epidemic through the experiences of one woman, her family, and the community that supported each other through unthinkable loss, eventually leading to really look at global healthcare inequities, which Julie highlights in founding her work through the 30/30 Project, and I think what is today also the 30/30 Legacy Fund. And this for me was so powerful to read because what jumped out for me is it wasn't just about telling your story. It was also about controlling the narrative and standing up for yourself and standing up for other people in your life who, for whatever reason, didn't have the ability to have a voice to the extent that you did. Can you talk about that?
Well, I feel like that was the whole goal of our Speakers Bureau because in fact, I talk a lot about the people on the Speakers Bureau who died, and my publisher, I had to get legal permission to use their stories, and so from their next of kin, and it was a lot of work. And my publisher just kept saying, "Well, why don't you just change their names?" And I'm like, "That's the whole point. These were the people who were brave enough to say their names and stand up and educate in the face of opposition and discrimination. So that's the last thing I want to do is change their names. Some of them, their families already rejected them and there's no record of their life, So, I think that was the goal of our Speakers Bureau, was to make life easier for people who, for whatever good reason, couldn't go public. And I understood that completely, having kept our story secret for 4 years. And I do think there are reasons not to share your HIV status then and now. I mean, I experienced job discrimination. I mean, there's real stuff out there, even still, that is a threat to people's livelihoods. And sometimes HIV is not in their top 10 worst problems, and they don't, there are reasons not to share or so anyway, so we felt like that was sort of our calling. It was to educate the general public and especially the healthcare providers about the facts and about the fact that these were real people with real lives who had feelings, and that they were not in any way a threat to someone else's health unless you were having sex with them or sharing needles with them, or they were your infected mother having you as a child. So it's like, and that's usually not the people in your audience. So, so that was our whole goal.
For all of you listening in to Flourish or Fold Stories of Resilience, I want to share with you an online course that we have on our website. We're going to go ahead and drop the website in our show notes, or you can go to www.resilience-leadership.com and check out our offerings. We've got an incredible course for you called Flourish, the 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People. So if you love what you're learning about in this podcast, if you love these conversations on resilience, if you love hearing about how you can more effectively face the inevitable moments of challenge, change, and complexity, or the 3 C's as I call them, in your life, then go ahead and check out our online course, Flourish, the 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People, because what you are going to find is a one-on-one tutorial with me around each of those 5 practices, as well as an introduction and a conclusion. We've got hours of content that is going to allow you to engage in direct coaching and learning with me on the 5 practices. Go ahead and check it out, and I hope you'll join us in our online course, Flourish, the 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People.
I'll talk about the 30/30 project is its own its own subject. I could write a whole book about it, but there's a lot about it in the third section of my book.
Yeah, great. I'd love for you to tell us about the 30/30 project. That would be amazing.
Well, okay, so my kids grew up, and on my 30th anniversary of being HIV positive, so my oldest is 30 by now, right? They wanted to do something to celebrate the fact that I had survived for so long. But that felt really awkward to me because so many of my friends died. So celebrating didn't seem like the right word. So I said, well, we should do something that's, that gives back. If it was a project that gave back in some good way in honor of all of our friends who died, that would feel okay. So I had been working for 3 years for an organization called Construction for Change. And they're a construction management nonprofit that builds infrastructure in around the world for other organizations working on behalf of the global poor and underserved communities. And they focus on healthcare, education, and community buildings, buildings that affect a whole community. So I had been vetting their projects partners. And so my big giant idea was, well, why don't we as a family raise enough money to build one healthcare facility somewhere in honor of our friends who died? And that seemed like a lot. And then my son, Ryan, who is Ryan Lewis from Macklemore and Ryan Lewis, they had just, won Grammys and had a top album, the top hip hop album of the year. And he just looked at me and he goes, in his 24 or 5-year-old optimism, said, Mom, we can't just build one. We need to build 30. You've lived 30 years. And I'm just like, that is so many more than one. And I was kind of like, that is not going to happen. But somehow he talked me into this. And because we had this platform through his group, we ended up on national TV, on several national talk shows when we launched the 30/30 project. And our goal was to raise money to build 30 healthcare facilities around the world in areas that had a high HIV incidence or that needed comprehensive healthcare. And so that was in 2014, so almost 10 years ago. And it was a lot for someone with HIV and not, completely healthy to take on. But at first, it was just an idea, we're going to do this. So I just went, I was a public speaker. He made me a cool video. I had 10 years of speaking experience on this speaking bureau. So I just went to anyone and everyone with this idea that healthcare spaces could create healthcare access. And it was kind of slow going at first. Ben Haggerty and Ryan and the Macklemore team did donate $1 per ticket with the Plus One organization. And they sold our t-shirts. We had t-shirts that said healthcare is a human right. And so they funded probably 3 of the healthcare facilities in those early days. And they also were personally invested. So that was a huge help. T-Mobile funded a clinic. I mean, things started happening, but 30 is a lot, right?
A lot.
So the best thing that we did, as far as this is like a nonprofit tip, if that's what you do, the best thing we did is after the first few healthcare facilities were finished, we hired someone that did measurement and evaluation. And we started just, doing real data collection, like how many people are walking in the door, how many people are getting HIV tests, how many pregnant women are getting prenatal care, how many babies are being delivered. And once we had hard data that proved that healthcare spaces were creating healthcare access, it wasn't just a catchment area of 20,000 people. It was more like people are coming in this building and this is what's happening. The last 2 years, it took us 5 years to raise the money. The last 2 years, money came in quite quickly because we just had some great stuff going. We partnered at the end of the day. we built 31 healthcare facilities. Well, the last one's being built right now, for 18 different organizations in 9 different countries. So
Wow.
crazy.
Wow.
And it was a huge community of mostly women who supported all of that work. So
congratulations.
it was, if you had told me the day I said yes to that it was going to take 10 years and that it was going to cost me so much, I would have had to think twice. But it's kind of like boiling a frog slowly. Like, I just was sort of like, sure. And then, like, eventually you're just like in it so deep. And then it was like, wow, now I just can't believe that we were successful at that. It took a village. Let's just say that. People always say, oh,
Yes.
Julie Lewis and the 33 Project. I'm like, it was so many more people than me that pulled that off, but I was the visionary, and I was the spokesperson. And so I'm kind of at the tail end of that. And when COVID hit, I was really happy our money was raised, but it was when I had wanted to write my memoir. And so I wrote it along with my friend Jenny Koenig, who happened to be high-risk pregnancy at the time. So we were both like super isolators. So like, it was nice to have one person you were on Zoom with every day, because neither of us could really go out and about in those early years of COVID because we were so high risk.
Yeah. Well, I love the story of the 3030 project of, building 31 healthcare facilities, of just the fact that one seemed like a lot, and the story about Ryan really tapping into the possibility and saying, let's not just do 1, let's do 30. And you're like, that's so many more. That's like 29 more than I even thought was possible. And I think
so
it's such a
more.
testament.
Yeah.
So many more.
You just think about remodeling your kitchen and how much that effort that takes. Then think about building a whole building, and then think about doing that 30 times in 9 different countries that have all these different rules of permitting. Like, thank goodness for Construction for Change, because that is really their specialty of building in high risk, in just hard to reach places. And I really could not have pulled this off without them at all. I can't build anything, but it was a lot, and it took a lot of people. So anyway.
You and I were talking about your book, Still Positive, which I know that so many people that are listening today have already downloaded it. They've already gone to Amazon and purchased a copy. And I love that you talked about that. It's like with the turquoise cover, and you just type in HIV/AIDS, and it's, one of the few books that pops up because so few people are talking about this. And yet you've said a few times, here, this is not a story actually of HIV/AIDS. It's a mom story. It's a family story. It's a story of connection and relationships. Can you talk to us about how you think about the story, not starting or stopping with a healthcare diagnosis, but really being a family story and a mom story for you?
Well, I think that all families eventually, if they haven't already, all people, will come up against some crises in their life at some point. Like, if you haven't yet, good luck. You're not going to get out of here without that. And we all die. We just don't think about that we're going to possibly die young, or in an unusual way, or whatever. And because of that, families have to cope, and you have to learn how to live your life as a family within that, or it is a tremendous amount of stress and pressure on families when they don't have an extended support group, which we were just lucky to already have. As far as this being a mom story, it's like when there is an adult problem, serious problem in your family, and you have small children, you have to make all these decisions about when to tell your children something's happening, how to answer questions, what's the most important use of our time as a family? How do we get the help we need? How do I build out my kids' community so that if I die, they still have a community? I mean, it kind of goes on, and I talk about a lot of these questions. And then, when something tragic happens to a child, I know this because I've been to lots of therapists and child therapists, they kind of have to revisit that their whole life as they come to a new phase of life. And my kids are still literally doing that. Now they have their own children. So they think back on our story, like, wow, what would have I done if I was their mom? And I'm sure they would have done different. We were winging it. There was no manual on HIV and families when we got this. So we were just doing the best we could. But I can tell you, there are decisions I would have made differently, right? But you can't, like, you just do the best you can. That's parenting, right? We all look back and do that. But even now, like, all of my kids have some level of anxiety. Of course they do. We ended up, it's in the book, one of my friends died, and her husband had died, and her daughter, who's Ryan's age, had died when she was 7 of HIV. She was born positive, and she had 2 other boys, and one of them came to live with us when he was a teenager until he graduated. And so we ended up being a blended family. That in itself, there's lots of blended families out there. We had blended family issues for 4 years and still kind of do, right? These are all decisions families have to deal with. As adult children, we all have some level of anxiety. It was traumatic. My kids had a trauma. One of my kids, when they were in adult therapy, kind of was going in, when my mom, she was HIV positive, and the therapist goes, wait, stop, what? And my mom was HIV positive, and she goes, oh, that's a whole lot of coping. And that's true. It was just a whole lot of coping. And even for Scott and I, in the midst of this crisis, I talk about this in the 3rd section of the book, we were just, when you're in a crisis or when you're managing something serious, you're just trying to survive. And then, as we grew out of that phase where the meds were working, our kids were grown up, all of a sudden we had marital issues because we had just been stuffing all of this other stuff for years just to survive, right? So then we're in therapy. This is life. Like, this book is just about freaking life. But if you do have a unique, very intense situation happening in your life with children, you'll relate to this book. Yeah.
Yeah. I love, Julie, how there's so many things that you've said that are just so deeply powerful. And one that I want to attach to in this moment is the humanity that you continue to tap into throughout this entire conversation. And rather than sort of, hanging on to, right, the diagnosis, right, the name, right, to really be able to pivot toward the humanity of the experience. And, for so many people who might be thinking, well, I don't know anyone with HIV/AIDS. I haven't come into contact with this myself. You take sort of the uniqueness, and you have a beautiful way of being able to universalize it and say, okay, this is just life. This is just family. This is just being a mom. And here's, sort of the constellation of things that we have been faced with. And yet every family will be faced with some universal, difficult decision, unexpected diagnosis, unanticipated turn of events. And in that moment, I think everyone can say, yes, in a way, it's not the same thing, but it's also my story too.
Exactly. And yeah, and I do have a thread because my husband was an ordained minister full-time doing youth work. There's a thread of just the church and spirituality in my book too. And there was, at that time, we were deeply into the evangelical church, and there was this uncomfortableness with people, especially church people, to just have something be sad. It's like they always wanted to flip it to like, God's going to use this in wonderful ways, which perhaps he has, but, or she has, however you define God. But it's like, in the moment when you hear someone's terrible story or diagnosis, just, it's okay to be sad. It's sad, but it's like our culture has such a hard time with that. Yeah. So I think these are universal things. I hear this from people who have cancer, with people who's, had an unexpected death. There are some people who have capacity to like just sit in that with you, but they're few. There's not a
Yeah.
lot of people who have that ability, and they're a gift from God when you find them. To just, it's okay to just, cuss a little bit and just be pissed off. It's like that you can, you don't have to flip that immediately to what positive thing am I going to do now? That takes a lot of, I don't know, acceptance. And yeah, I just really don't want people to think that, they have some hard thing and they just have to flip it to be positive. That took time. And yeah, and I really appreciate it. The thing I loved about this speakers bureau I was on, we were so inappropriate all the time about this disease. We would we would tell really sick jokes, but we laugh, you know what I mean? Because we were all dying. And, it is that there is some comfort in just misery at life loves company, and that's okay. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
One of the things that's come through for me as you've been talking during our interview today, is this, and I want to check this out with you and see how this feels. One of the things that I've thought since you've been talking is this, over time, over the last 30 years, right? You received what would have been considered 30 years ago to be a quote unquote death sentence. And yet what I've heard from you is how that death sentence actually taught you to live in a new and different way.
It did. And I think that would be true even of my friends who died. I mean, yeah, when you think you're going to die, you start to think, oh, well, what am I doing now? And do I even care about this? And some things you just have to do. I mean, if you want to eat, you have to make money, and you might have to just go to that job you don't like. But what can you do with the rest of the day when you're done with that? We all have these things we don't want to do. But, it's kind of like you start to notice even the free stuff, you start to notice the clouds, and you start to notice the, well, you do smell the roses, and children are just so like it was hard to be sad with 3 little kids. They're just pretty quite entertaining, even in their bad moments, they're kind of funny. So yeah. And so that was, even as an older grandma now, I have 6 grandkids, even on a bad day, it's just fun to pet my cat or hang out with my grandkids and let it go. Like, I know that's like that Disney movie, but like, there's just so many things that aren't worth your energy. And I have learned that big time. And so has my brother. It's like, don't hold grudges, just let it go. It is so a waste of your time and energy to hold things that are just not a big deal. Yeah. So
That's
those
beautiful.
are the things I've learned.
Well, Julie Lewis, it has been such an honor and a pleasure to have you here on Flourish or Fold, Stories of Resilience. Our audience is so excited about your book. I know everyone's going to go out and get a copy of Still Positive. We're going to have more information in our show notes about the 30/30 legacy. And it's just been a delight and an honor to have you here with me today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I just wanted to add that all the proceeds from our book go to organizations working towards healthcare access and equity through our new fund, the 30/30 Project Legacy Fund. So it doesn't matter how you buy it, those funds will go to our fund. get to places where they're going to help people. So thanks so much for having me. This was really great. Yeah.
It's been such a delight to have you. And I think that's such an important point because, the holidays are coming up. This episode is out in December, and people are always thinking about what is something that is really going to be powerful for the people in our family, our friends, our relatives, sort of already have everything. And what about a beautiful story of an unexpected diagnosis and turn of events, something that was quote unquote a death sentence, but actually taught you to live and has so many beautiful learnings in it. And all of the proceeds from this book go to providing greater access and greater health equity. So what's not a win-win? What's not to love about this book and about your story?
Well, thanks. It's really amazing that people are reading my life story, and we've gotten some great reviews. It's also been a great book club book pick. So anyway, thanks for having me. I could keep talking, but let's.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. What an honor and a delight to have you here.
Yeah, happy holidays.
In thinking about my conversation with Julie today, what was incredibly striking for me is how anytime we're faced with death or a loss of life, it really punctuates just the blessing of what it means to be alive. I love how Julie talked about smelling the roses, looking at the sky, how often we take for granted this next precious moment that we have in our lives. So I want to encourage all of you, building on my conversation with Julie, please enjoy your life today. Recognize what a blessing it is to be alive. I remember when friends of mine were turning 40 and 50 and they were saying, I'm getting so old. And I remember friends of mine that passed away in their teens and in their 20s and what they would have given for one more day, one more month, one more year. So please, every year of life, every day, no matter what's happening for you, take a moment and enjoy this beautiful life that we've given, the one that we've been given. The one thing that we have in common is that life will inevitably come to an end. This life is terminal. So enjoy the moments that you have. Until next time, this is Dr. Taryn Marie. For all of you listening in to Flourish or Fold Stories of Resilience, I want to share with you an online course that we have on our website. We're going to go ahead and drop the website in our show notes, or you can go to www.resilience-leadership.com and check out our offerings. We've got an incredible course for you called Flourish, the 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People. So if you love what you're learning about in this podcast, if you love these conversations on resilience, if you love hearing about how you can more effectively face the inevitable moments of challenge, change, and complexity, or the 3 C's as I call them, in your life, then go ahead and check out our online course, Flourish, the 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People, because what you are going to find is a one-on-one tutorial with me around each of those 5 practices, as well as an introduction and a conclusion. We've got hours of content that is going to allow you to engage in direct coaching and learning with me on the 5 practices. Go ahead and check it out, and I hope you'll join us in our online course, Flourish, the 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People.